The late afternoon sun bathed Washington Park in Denver, Colorado, in golden light. A light breeze rustled through the towering cottonwood trees, carrying the sound of distant laughter and the rhythmic footfalls of joggers on the paved trails. Families lounged on checkered picnic blankets. Children chased each other through the grass, and cyclists weaved through the pathways, lost in their own world. At the edge of the park, Judge Elena Morgan sat alone on a weathered wooden bench, absorbed in a thick leather-bound book. It was a rare moment of peace, one she had learned to savor in the midst of her demanding career. At 56 years old, Elena had spent decades navigating the intricacies of the justice system, earning a reputation for her unshakable integrity and keen legal mind. But today, she was simply another Denver resident, enjoying the quiet of the afternoon. The tranquility shattered with the abrupt screech of tires against pavement. A black and white police cruiser lurched to a stop near the curb, its red and blue lights flashing, though no siren blared. A few heads turned, momentarily distracted, before returning to their activities. But Elena felt the weight of their arrival immediately. Two officers emerged, Officer Mitchell Carter and Officer Ryan Dawson, their stiff postures radiating authority. They scanned the park with precision, but their focus quickly zeroed in on her. She was the only one sitting alone. The only one who didn't blend into the clusters of families or groups of friends. "Ma'am," Carter called out, his tone neutral but laced with quiet suspicion. "Can we have a word?" Elena looked up from her book, keeping her expression calm. A seasoned judge, she recognized the underlying tension in his voice. "Of course," she replied smoothly, closing the book with deliberate care. Dawson stepped closer, his gaze sharp. "We received a call about some suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Elena raised an eyebrow, her confusion genuine. "Suspicious activity," she repeated. "I'm reading." She lifted her book slightly, as if to reinforce the obvious. But the officers didn't budge. The air around them grew thick with unspoken tension. A few passers-by slowed their steps, sensing the shift. Elena had presided over countless cases involving law enforcement. But now, for the first time, she was on the other side of their scrutiny. She exhaled slowly, feeling the first flicker of unease. Something about this encounter felt wrong. Elena kept her posture steady, her hands resting on the book in her lap. Years in the courtroom had taught her the power of composure, measured words, and calculated expressions. But out here, in the open air of Washington Park, she was no longer Judge Elena Morgan. She was just a black woman being questioned by two armed officers. Officer Carter took another step forward, his shadow stretching across the bench as the late afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky. His partner, Dawson, stood slightly behind him, his hand resting near his utility belt, not gripping his weapon, but close enough that the gesture didn't go unnoticed. "We need to see some ID," Carter said, his voice clipped. Elena's heartbeat quickened, but she remained calm. "What's the reason for this?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Am I being accused of something?" "It's routine," Dawson interjected, his tone carrying an edge that suggested otherwise. A small crowd had begun to gather, a jogger slowing to a walk, a man pausing with his dog, a young woman fishing her phone out of her bag. People weren't intervening, but they were watching. Elena exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to argue. She reached into her purse and retrieved her driver's license, holding it out between two fingers. Carter took it, scanning the name. "Elena Morgan," he read aloud, pausing for just a beat too long. His eyes flickered over her again, as if the name meant something. Maybe it did. Maybe he had heard it before, read it in a news article, seen her preside over a case. "What's your business here, Miss Morgan?" he asked, the way he said her name making it clear he didn't believe her presence was as innocent as she claimed. Elena's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "I live in this city," she said. "I came here to enjoy the park. Like everyone else." Carter handed her ID back, but instead of stepping away, he remained rooted in place, glancing at Dawson before continuing. "Do you always carry a book like that around?" he asked, nodding at the hardcover in her lap. The absurdity of the question almost made her laugh. "Excuse me? Just curious," Dawson added, shifting his stance. "Are you waiting for someone? Or are you out here alone?" And there it was, the underlying message in their words. She didn't belong. She needed to justify her existence in this space. Elena sat up straighter, squaring her shoulders. I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of. Carter's expression darkened. Don't get smart with us, he snapped. We're just doing our job. And I know the law, Elena countered, her voice calm but firm. And I know I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park. The air between them crackled with tension. The onlookers had grown still, watching, waiting. A man in a baseball cap discreetly lifted his phone, the lens aimed in their direction. Dawson saw it too. His jaw flexed. Come on, he muttered under his breath to Carter. Let's just. But Carter had already decided. He reached for Elena's arm. You're resisting, he said, though she hadn't moved. Elena's breath caught. What are you doing? Stop resisting. Carter repeated, louder this time, as if performing for the growing crowd. Before she could process what was happening, cold metal snapped around her wrists. The murmurs of the crowd turned to voices of protest. Someone shouted, "Hey, she wasn't doing anything." Another called out, "I got this on video." Elena's heart pounded as Carter and Dawson pulled her to her feet, their grips firm. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about suspicion. This was about control. And no matter what she said, no matter who she was, they had already decided she was guilty of something. The steel cuffs bit into Elena's wrists as Officer Carter tightened them, his grip unrelenting. She forced herself to stay calm, to keep her breathing steady. She had spent years in courtrooms, defending the rights of others, people who had been wrongfully accused, who had faced the weight of a system that too often worked against them. But today, she was the one being dragged away. The voices of the crowd grew louder, a mixture of outrage and disbelief. "This is wrong," someone shouted. "She wasn't doing anything." Another voice called out, "I got it all on video," a young woman said, her phone held high. Elena locked eyes with her as she was led toward the squad car. A silent understanding passed between them, a plea, a promise. Make sure the world sees this. But Carter and Dawson ignored the outcry, their focus solely on restraining her as if she were a threat. "Ma'am, you need to calm down," Carter said as he shoved her forward. "I am calm," Elena shot back, refusing to let her voice waver. "You're the ones escalating this." The door to the squad car swung open, and before she could brace herself, Dawson pushed her inside. The impact sent a sharp jolt up her spine as she landed against the hard plastic seat. The door slammed shut. For the first time, Elena was alone with her thoughts. The world outside the car felt distant now, muffled by the thick glass. She could still see the crowd, their faces twisted in concern, their phones still recording. Her wrists ached from the cuffs. Her pulse pounded in her ears. How had this happened? One moment, she had been enjoying a book in the park. The next, she was being treated like a criminal. Through the windshield, she saw Carter and Dawson talking outside, their heads close together, their expressions unreadable. They knew they were being watched. But it didn't seem to faze them. Finally, Carter slid into the driver's seat. Dawson took the passenger side. And without another word, the car pulled away from the curb. The ride to the station was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Elena stared out the window, watching the city blur past. Her reflection stared back at her, faintly illuminated by the glow of passing streetlights. She had presided over hundreds of cases, had seen people walk into her courtroom in these same cuffs, some guilty, some innocent. But never, in all her years, had she imagined she would be one of them. When they reached the Denver Police Department, Carter yanked the door open and gestured for her to step out. "Let's go," he said flatly. Elena swung her legs out of the car, stepping onto the cold pavement. She kept her head high, refusing to let them see weakness. Inside, the humiliation continued. Her fingerprints were taken, her mugshot captured under harsh fluorescent lighting. The booking officer barely looked at her, treating her as just another name on a long list. Then came the holding cell, a small windowless room with nothing but a metal bench and a toilet in the corner. The door clanged shut behind her. Elena sat down slowly, folding her hands in her lap. She could still hear Carter and Dawson laughing somewhere beyond the bars. "Enjoy your stay," one of them had sneered before walking away. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. forcing down the frustration boiling in her chest. This wasn't over. She wasn't just another case file. She was Judge Elena Morgan, and no matter how much they tried to strip away her dignity, they had no idea what was coming next. The cold metal bench beneath Elena was unforgiving, the chill seeping through the thin fabric of her blouse. The air in the holding cell was stale, thick with the scent of disinfectant, and something metallic, something she had smelled before in courtrooms. On evidence tables. The scent of institutional indifference. She exhaled slowly, unclasping her fingers, studying the raw marks left by the handcuffs. They still burned. Somewhere beyond the bars, the station bustled with activity, the hum of voices, the shuffling of paperwork, the occasional burst of laughter from officers who had long since become numb to the walls around them. Elena, however, had never felt more aware of her surroundings. She had spent years ensuring the justice system worked for the people, for those who had been wronged, for those who didn't have the means to defend themselves. Yet here she was, trapped in the very system she had spent her life trying to hold accountable. A guard approached the bars, clipboard in hand. He was young, maybe late 20s, with tired eyes that barely flickered with interest. "Elena Morgan," he called out, monotone. "You're being charged with resisting arrest and obstruction of justice." Elena let out a sharp laugh, a sound without humor. Resisting? She hadn't even moved. She sat forward. On what grounds? The guard shrugged, barely looking up from his clipboard. "You can discuss that in court." She clenched her jaw. Discuss it in court? The absurdity of it all hit her like a punch to the gut. If she weren't a judge, if she didn't know how these cases played out, she could very well be stuck in this system for months, maybe years, fighting charges that never should have existed in the first place. But she did know how these cases worked. And she knew exactly what had to be done. The guard walked away without another word, leaving her alone once again. Elena leaned back against the cold cinderblock wall, closing her eyes. She had options. She wasn't powerless. And she would not let this stand. Hours passed. The fluorescent lights above her buzzed incessantly, flickering in uneven intervals. The only indication of time passing was the occasional changing of the guard. Finally, a familiar voice cut through the monotony. "Elena." She opened her eyes to see Jordan Reed, her longtime friend and fellow attorney, standing on the other side of the bars. His expression was a mixture of relief and anger. "Are you okay?" he asked, gripping the bars. She gave him a slow nod. "I've been better." Jordan turned to the officer at the desk. "She's being released on bail." "Now?" The officer barely glanced at him. "Paperwork's processing. Sit tight." Jordan muttered something under his breath but didn't argue. He turned back to Elena. "What the hell happened?" he asked. Elena sighed, rubbing her temples. "Racial profiling. Unnecessary force. A complete disregard for the law." She shook her head. "They didn't care who I was. All they saw was a black woman sitting alone in a park, and that was enough." Jordan's jaw tightened. "They have no idea who they just messed with." A dry smile flickered across her lips. "They will." The officer finally unlocked the door, and Elena stepped out. The cuffs were gone, but the marks they left remained. As she and Jordan walked toward the exit, the cool night air hit her like a wave. It was fresh, crisp freedom in its purest form. But as they reached the car, Jordan hesitated. "What are you thinking?" Elena turned to him, her eyes burning with unshaken resolve. "I'm thinking," she said slowly. "I have the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to fight back. And I will. Because this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been silenced, humiliated, or dismissed." And Elena Morgan was done staying quiet. The next morning, Elena Morgan was a woman on a mission. She sat at her kitchen table, legal pads scattered around her, her laptop open to pages of case law and precedents. The coffee in her mug had gone cold, untouched, as she methodically constructed her next move. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about exposing the system that had allowed two officers to abuse their power without hesitation. Jordan Reed sat across from her, flipping through a stack of printouts. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Elena didn't look up. "I don't have a choice." Jordan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You know how this goes. They'll fight this tooth and nail. The department will protect them. The union will back them. They'll try to drag you through the mud. Elena finally met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. Let them try. By noon, the lawsuit was filed. Elena was suing the Denver Police Department, officers Carter and Dawson, and the city itself for wrongful arrest, excessive force, and civil rights violations. The moment the court documents hit the system, the news spread like wildfire. The local media picked up the story first. Then came the national outlets. The video from Washington Park, the footage of Elena calmly responding as two officers escalated the situation, had gone viral. And the country was watching. In the days that followed, support poured in. Community activists reached out, sharing their own stories of police misconduct. Lawyers and civil rights groups offered assistance, eager to take on the case alongside her. But not everyone was on her side. The police union released a statement, calling the arrest lawful and justified. They painted the officers as professionals just doing their jobs, and accused Elena of playing the victim to push an agenda. Elena read the statement without so much as blinking. She had seen these tactics before: the shifting of blame, the manipulation of public perception. But the truth was on her side, and she knew how to use it. As the first court hearing approached, Elena prepared like she always had, methodically, relentlessly. She pored over past cases of wrongful arrest, building a strategy that left no room for doubt. She gathered expert witnesses, including former officers turned whistleblowers, who would testify about the culture of abuse and cover-ups within the department. Most importantly, she had the video. The raw, undeniable proof of what had been done to her. The night before the hearing, Jordan found her still working, papers spread across the floor of her office. He crossed his arms. "You should get some sleep." Elena didn't look up. "I will when this is over." Jordan shook his head, watching her for a long moment. "This is bigger than just a lawsuit, Elena." She finally looked up, her expression unreadable. "I know. Because this wasn't just about her. It was about holding power accountable, and she wasn't backing down." Elena had spent weeks preparing for her lawsuit, meticulously building a case that would hold officers Carter and Dawson accountable for their abuse of power. But as she sat in her office one morning, reviewing new court filings, her phone rang. It was her clerk from the Denver District Court. "Elena," the woman said, her voice careful, "I just wanted to give you a heads up. You've been assigned to preside over a case." Elena frowned, and a pause. Then, "It's an internal misconduct hearing for officers Carter and Dawson." For a moment, Elena didn't move. She sat in stunned silence, the weight of the irony pressing down on her. The very men who had humiliated her, who had illegally arrested her, cuffed her in front of a crowd, treated her like a criminal, were now appearing before her bench. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of humor. She inhaled slowly, her mind racing. Could she do this? Could she sit in that chair, wear the robe, and rule over this case without letting personal bias cloud her judgment? She closed her eyes for a brief moment, then exhaled. Yes. Because unlike them, she believed in the law. The courtroom was packed the next morning. News had already spread. Elena Morgan, the judge who had been wrongfully arrested, was about to preside over the hearing of the officers who had arrested her. Reporters lined the back wall, their pens poised, their cameras waiting. Lawyers murmured among themselves, glancing toward the defense table where Carter and Dawson sat in their uniforms. Their faces pale, their confidence visibly shaken. They hadn't expected this. Elena stepped into the courtroom, her black robe flowing behind her, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. The moment she took her seat behind the bench, an unmistakable shift settled over the room. The power dynamic had changed. She picked up her gavel, tapped it once, then leveled her gaze at the defendants. "This court is now in session," she announced, her voice steady. "Please be seated." Carter and Dawson stiffened, their hands gripping the table in front of them. Elena let a beat of silence pass, letting them feel the weight of the moment. Then, with unwavering composure, she said, "Let's begin." The prosecution wasted no time. The evidence was damning. Surveillance footage, witness testimony, a history of prior complaints against both officers. But the most damaging piece? The video from Washington Park. It was played on the courtroom screen for all to see the moment Carter and Dawson approached her with baseless suspicion, the moment they ignored her legal rights, the moment they manufactured an excuse to arrest her. Elena sat, still and silent, as she watched herself on screen being shoved into the squad car. The room was silent. When the video ended, the prosecutor turned to Carter. "Officer Carter," he said, "watching that footage, do you still believe your actions were justified?" Carter shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Dawson before clearing his throat. He hesitated. "At the time, I thought." The prosecutor cut him off. "I didn't ask what you thought. I asked if your actions were justified." A heavy silence. Then, finally, Carter exhaled and dropped his gaze. "No," he admitted. Dawson looked away. Elena didn't flinch, because the truth was finally in the open. And soon, justice would follow. The courtroom was packed, the tension palpable as Elena prepared to deliver her ruling. Every seat was filled, and even the back wall was lined with spectators, reporters, legal analysts, members of the community who had followed every development of the case. This was no longer just about two officers and their misconduct. It was about a system that had allowed them to act with impunity. At the defense table, Officers Carter and Dawson sat stiffly, their uniforms now symbols of disgrace rather than authority. Neither man looked as self-assured as they had when they'd arrested her in the park. The weight of their actions and the consequences were now undeniable. Elena took a steady breath before addressing the room. "This court is now in session," she announced, tapping her gavel once. The prosecution rose. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "the evidence against Officers Carter and Dawson is overwhelming. The video footage, the witness testimonies, and their own statements have made it clear that their actions on the day of Miss Morgan's arrest were not only unjustified, but a gross abuse of power." He paced slightly before turning back toward the bench. "These officers violated their oath to protect and serve. They took an innocent civilian and turned her into a suspect because of their own biases. And, most importantly, they did so with the expectation that there would be no consequences." He let the words hang in the air before concluding. "It is the duty of this court to ensure that no officer, no public servant believes themselves to be above the law." Elena nodded, absorbing the weight of his words before shifting her gaze to the defense attorney. The defense lawyer stood, adjusting his tie. He knew this was an uphill battle, and his voice lacked the confidence he had likely hoped for. "Your Honor," he began, "we acknowledge that my clients made errors in judgment that day." There was an audible murmur from the gallery. "Errors in judgment?" That was how they were framing this? The lawyer continued, "However, we argue that the situation escalated due to misunderstandings, not malice. My clients were following procedure as they were trained to do. And while mistakes were made, they were not acting with intentional prejudice." Elena raised an eyebrow, but remained silent. She let the defense conclude, allowed both sides to present their final words. And then, it was her turn. The room fell still as she picked up her ruling. Elena took a slow, deliberate breath before speaking. "The role of law enforcement is to serve and protect the community with integrity, fairness, and respect." She looked directly at Carter and Dawson, her voice even but firm. "When those entrusted with that responsibility abuse their power, they not only harm individuals, they erode the trust of the entire community." She let the words settle before continuing. "The evidence in this case has shown a pattern of misconduct. Officers Carter and Dawson acted without just cause, detained an innocent civilian, and fabricated an excuse to justify their actions. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a violation of constitutional rights." She shifted slightly, her tone steady but unwavering. "As such, the court finds Officers Carter and Dawson guilty of misconduct and abuse of authority." A hush fell over the room, quickly followed by murmurs of relief, satisfaction, and even quiet applause. Elena wasn't done. She turned back toward the defendants. "Officer Carter," she said, her voice cool, "you have a documented history of excessive force complaints, and your behavior in this case demonstrates a disregard for both the law and the people you are sworn to serve. Effective immediately, you are dismissed from duty and permanently barred from serving in law enforcement." Carter's face drained of color. He sat motionless, his lips pressed into a thin line. She then turned to Dawson. "Officer Dawson, while your record does not reflect the same pattern of repeated offenses, your participation in this incident is inexcusable. You are hereby suspended without pay and are required to undergo extensive retraining." Any future misconduct will result in immediate termination. Dawson nodded stiffly, swallowing hard. Elena placed her hands on the bench. This court is adjourned. She brought the gavel down, final and firm. The aftermath was immediate. As the courtroom emptied, members of the community approached her, some thanking her, others simply nodding in understanding. She had done what so many before her had been denied a chance to hold those in power accountable. Carter and Dawson left the room quickly, their futures uncertain, their arrogance gone. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for All and Accountability Matters." As Elena stepped onto the courthouse steps, she took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air wash over her. Jordan Reed, standing at her side, gave her a small, knowing smile. "You did it," he said. She turned to him, shaking her head slightly. "This isn't the end, Jordan." Because she knew this fight wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger. And she wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Elena Morgan's story is more than just a legal battle. It's a testament to courage, integrity, and the power of standing up for what is right. It reminds us that justice is not automatic. It must be fought for. Too often, those in power believe they are untouchable, that their actions will never be questioned. But accountability matters. For older generations, who have witnessed decades of social change, this story serves as a reminder that progress happens when people refuse to stay silent. It takes strength to challenge wrongdoing, to demand fairness in a world that often resists change. Elena used her knowledge, her position, and her voice not just for herself, but for those who have been silenced. This lesson applies to all of us. Never underestimate the power of persistence. Whether it's standing up to injustice, supporting someone in need, or simply using our wisdom to guide the next generation, we each have a role to play. The fight for justice doesn't end, it evolves. And as long as we continue to demand better, the world can change for the better. Elena Morgan's journey is a powerful reminder that justice prevails when we refuse to back down. Her courage in the face of injustice proves that one voice can spark change. But together, we can transform the system. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe to hear more inspiring tales of resilience, integrity, and the fight for what's right.